And we are ready to go. Welcome, everyone, to another New Jersey Constitutional Republican virtual conversation. It's my great privilege and pleasure today to have Professor John Schaff join me. John has written a very, very important book that we're going to be discussing. This will actually be the first of 3 episodes as we're going to thoroughly analyze his book, Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me here, JR. I'm very happy to be here and speak to all the people in New Jersey, where I have cousins, by the way. So I've it's been I won't say how many decades it's been, because I was 8 years old the last time I was actually in New Jersey, not counting airports, but I do have cousins in the Edison area.
Well, you're going to have to plan a visit and make sure we get together for that visit. And we'd love to have you down in southern New Jersey after you visit Edison.
I'd love to be there.
Now, give us a little bit of bio about yourself, Professor. Tell us about yourself and introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, if people maybe they'll figure out eventually from my goofy accent. I'm originally from Minnesota, so it's not a Canadian accent. It's just Minnesota. And I went to undergraduate school there. There's a Benedictine school there, St. John's University. I went there. Went out to Wyoming for a couple of years, got a master's degree, and it is all in government and political science. Went to Loyola University, Chicago, got my PhD there, and started here. I'm in Aberdeen, South Dakota, which if you've been to South Dakota, think of all the interesting stuff, and then go almost as far from it as you possibly can, and that's where we are. We're in the northeast part of the state at this smallish public university, but I've been here since the fall of 2001. 9/11 happened like my second week of teaching here. So I've been here. Oh. I'm in my 20th year at Northern, and I've written this book on Lincoln. Lincoln is one of my favorite things to research and write about. Written many things about Lincoln, including the book, and have another book on popular culture and philosophy. Sort of was I co-authored that with a buddy of mine. And teach a lot of classes. I just taught presidency class today. I teach American political thought, teach presidency, lots of grunt level American government to freshmen. That's sort of where it's at.
Well, it's great to have you with us. And I wanted to start the program out by showing a video, and I'm going to put it up here on the share screen so people can access this video. If you type in John Schaff on YouTube, you'll see this video, and it's called "Why American Politics is Screwed Up." And Professor, give us a little bit of background on it. I find it fascinating, with some very good points that you make, and some ideas that I had never really had considered before. And we'll talk about a little bit, but talk a little bit about this video, and I encourage the people to watch it.
This is a video, as people saw on the share screen, that there was a TEDx event out in Rapid City, which is right next to all the beautiful stuff in South Dakota and the Black Hills. This was, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, I guess it was, in the summer. The topic was, why is American politics all screwed up? And the main argument is that, and it's sort of an historical argument, is that our political parties are extremely weak, and our campaign finance law has sort of left politicians, candidates, kind of on their own, and this greatly incentivizes, if you will, extremist appeals, negative appeals, empowers interest groups, and that unlike in the 19th century, where political parties were very strong and served as kind of a gatekeeper and kind of an institutional control on candidates, that when we got all sorts of progressive reforms in the early 20th century, and those culminate with reforms in the 1970s. And these I think have contributed a lot to what Americans hate the most about their politics, and the promises that people can't keep, the negative campaigning, the permanent campaign style of activity, the inability to govern. I think a lot of it has to do with weak political parties. And so we have this irony that we live in this very partisan age, while our parties are actually institutionally very weak. And I don't think that's an accident. It's not really a paradox. So that sums it up in about 2 minutes. What took me 17 minutes to do in the video. So you can get the gist of it if you watch the whole video.
Yeah, I encourage our audience to watch the video, but one of the important points that you make among many is the fact that the campaign finance reform or the laws are really um, geared towards helping special interests rather
Yeah.
than the particular candidate, correct?
And incumbents. It's really geared towards rewarding incumbents. And then, I mean, the point is this: I think we all know that running for office, we might not like it, but it's necessarily expensive to run for office. And so, like to take the biggest campaign, for president, our two candidates this year, Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden, you add it up, are probably going to spend over $1 billion running for president. But by campaign I'm talking about just their campaign committees. I'm not talking about outside money. And their campaigns can raise that in contributions no more than $2,700 from individuals and $5,000 from political action committees. And for most of us, if I have $2,700 burning a hole in my pocket, I don't give it to a politician. To me, that's real money. But in politics, $2,700, I think we all know, is not really a lot of money. And so this means that politicians have to spend a lot of time raising money and a lot of effort. And the easiest way to do that is to work through interest groups who already have membership roles, who already have fundraising activity tied to it, and to appeal to them. And the thing about interest groups, a lot of interest groups do a lot of wonderful things, but almost by definition, interest groups are more extreme than the average voter is. And it tends to take our politicians and pull them to both sides, because for campaign finance reasons, they have to appeal to very specific interests as opposed to appealing to a broader middle.
Right. And you also make the good point that initially there was two parties in the Federalists and then the Democrats. Then the Federalists became extinct. Then it was only the Democratic Party. And then President Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson's successor, talked about the need for a two-party political system because the moderates would gravitate towards the middle of the two extremes, correct?
Yeah, and so the American founders, of course, were distrustful of political parties, and they wanted a system that was institutionally geared towards avoiding crass popular appeals, crass demagoguery. Now, political parties appeared, but then that era you're talking about, there is an era where when the Federalists disappeared, we essentially have nonpartisan politics because there's really only one party. Whatever you wanted, the Jeffersonian Republicans, they're the forerunners of today's Democratic Party, so let's call them Democrats. And so that, from Van Buren's point of view, this encouraged demagoguery, and he thought that political parties could serve the function that the founders thought the constitutional order would serve. That is, to, as an institution, discipline candidates who engage in extremist appeals to the people. And they did that from Jacksonian era, roughly the 1830s until, it's hard to put an end date, but certainly by 1972, that era of where political parties are the central organizing principle of American politics is over, and I think much to our detriment. Right.
Yeah, it's very interesting. People are going to want to watch the video. Another thing that I thought was interesting was the fact that you believe that the idea of superdelegates is actually more beneficial in the primary process. Explain that for us.
Well, again, the thing about, now, of course, the Democrats for a while, they greatly weakened them this election cycle, but the superdelegates had a lot of power. Now, Republicans haven't gone with superdelegates, just the Democrats have. Is that there are party leaders who have automatic votes at the convention. They don't have to win through a caucus or get chosen through a primary. They have automatic vote. And the point is that party leaders are more sensitive to the unstable, unnecessarily unstable coalition that makes up our political parties. So we all know that political parties are made up of, like, Ronald Reagan used to say, the Republican Party is a three-legged stool. You got foreign policy conservatives, social conservatives, economic conservatives. And we need all three parts of that stool in order to be successful. And the party leadership is more attuned to what it takes to keep, in this case, the Republican Party, they keep those three legs together, so to speak. We can't lean too far to one side or neglect one of those legs of the stool too much. but activists on the grassroots level tend to emphasize one leg of that stool more than the other and might throw it off tilt. And so I think the Democrats, they instituted superdelegates precisely because they kept losing presidential elections because they were nominating unelectable people, like Walter Mondale getting his rear end kicked in 1984. And so it's the first time that superdelegates really had a lot of power. They nominated a relatively moderate Democrat in Bill Clinton. That's not the only reason Clinton got the nomination, but it's not insignificant that the Democrats had changed their nomination system precisely to avoid the proverbial Northeast liberal from winning the nomination, like Michael Dukakis, and make it more likely that a Southern moderate, relatively like Bill Clinton, could get the nomination.
Right. And let's not forget, Professor, that Walter Mondale, of course, was a senator from Minnesota, right?
My home state. Much like many teams from Minnesota, both Walter Mondale and Hubert Humphrey were OFER in running for president. Like certain unnamed purple football teams that we could mention, but we will not mention that unpleasantness.
Well, I encourage the people, our audience, to watch the video. It's very informative, and it'll definitely spark interest in learning further about the history of political parties and what is good and what is bad about them. But now, Professor, I want to talk about this book that you've written. It came out last year. Is that correct?
Yeah, last summer.
I was made aware of this book reading the Claremont book review, of course, which you're also part of Claremont too, Professor, right? And I read a fine critique of the book, or if you will, review of the book, if you will, from our good friend, Dr. Alan Gelzo, who's in Princeton, and who's a great friend and mentor of ours. Of course, he's one of the foremost scholars on Abraham Lincoln in the world. And he was very complimentary of your book, and that's what brought me to buying it. And I just want to show the people what the book looks like. This is what you're going to want to get. You can get this on Amazon. Here's the cover of the book. It's entitled Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. Yeah. And it's an extraordinary read. And we're going to take our time. Like I said, this is the first of 3 editions that we're going to have with the professor, who's kind enough to join us today, and also 2 more times, as we're really going to get into this book, because I think it's imperative for constitutional Republicans, not only in New Jersey, but of course we have the Delaware constitutional Republicans now being led up by Chris Rowe, and there's talk about Pennsylvania and Maryland coming in. So this constitutional Republican movement is going to look to this book as a great source of information, as our objective, Professor, is to bring the Republican Party back to the personality, the intellect, the prudence, if you will, of Abraham Lincoln. And so this book is really, it's very vital. And I highly encourage everyone to go out and get this book. Now, talk to us a little bit about the impetus behind your creating this book, Professor. What was it that got you initially started with wanting to write this?
When I don't want to go way back into the dark ages, but really when I was a graduate student in Chicago at Loyola, I wrote a dissertation on Lincoln that really makes it more the second half of the book. Some of that is stuff I did in my dissertation about Lincoln and domestic policy, by which I mean non-war policy. And the Lincoln administration, looking at Lincoln as a presidential leader on non-war public policy. Then, of course, that's really where my interest in Lincoln was sparked. And I just kept reading and writing more about Lincoln, and I became, the kind of hook that really came to me as I want to put all this stuff together and put it into a book, is this idea of statesmanship, and the idea, in the subtitle of the book, this idea of limits of liberal democracy. Is the purpose of statesmanship is, especially in a democratic setting, is I think we all know, if we look into our souls, we all want things that we shouldn't have, whether it's public policy or maybe that third donut, right? We all want things we don't have, and so we need someone to tell us no. And so even Alexander Hamilton in Frellis number 71 says that it's the purpose of the president, why the president is given a little bit longer term of 4 years, is so he can withstand the whims of the people, and and be proven right over time, and gain re-election because he's been proven right. And I think a lot of what I learned from Lincoln is this idea of limits, is that there are a lot of things that in as a democracy, it's got to be self-imposed, right? Our limits are self-imposed because eventually when it comes down to it, the people rule. And so a statesman has to, through his dedication to the rule of law and through his rhetoric, has to encourage the people to limit themselves and to live within these limits, because majority tyranny, it might be majority, but that second word is still tyranny. And the founders weren't naive. They knew that democracies could devolve into tyrannies as much as any other form of government. And so Lincoln's statesmanship is really focused on this idea of teaching the people to limit themselves and to try to as I put it, kind of reconfigure the architecture of the democratic soul to be dedicated to certain principles that limit the democratic will and aim it towards justice and good government.
Right. And of course, statesmanship, Professor, really is a dying commodity amongst our representatives today. And this is precisely what the constitutional Republicans are calling for, is that our representatives exude more statesmanship. And as constitutional Republicans, we believe in the structure of the Constitution as what protects our natural rights. It's the separation of powers between the three branches of government. It's not necessarily the specific Bill of Rights, which is part of the Constitution, but it's the Madisonian, if you will, structure of the Constitution that we believe that needs to be reinvigorated or reestablished, or a reformation, so forth. But there's no question that we look to Lincoln, who was, and I thought it was very interesting in the first chapter, you talk about, Lincoln talked about the House divided speech, which was really one of the more radical ideas that he ever really talked about. Yeah. And I think you mentioned that Stephen Douglas kind of tried to exploit that a bit during the debates. And it was almost uncharacteristic of Lincoln to use that type of language, because he was so moderate and he exercised such prudence in his remarks.
And I think, if you look at Lincoln as a young man and as a politician in Illinois, and he wrote some anonymous political things, and he was a bit of a firebrand, to the point of he almost got involved in a duel at one point. And I think he learned his lesson, that this is not the way to win friends and convince people. And so that the House divided speech, even though it's very famous and there's a lot of truth in it, it ended up, I think, politically coming back on him, because even though I think obviously Douglas was distorting Lincoln's point, which was, I think, a truism. The nation was either going to be half, it could not exist half slave and half free. It was going to be one or the other. But Douglas would exploit that rhetoric to say, look, he wants to divide the nation. That's not what Lincoln meant at all. But that's what I mean. But I think Lincoln's typical. Once you get into more of his political maturity, say starting in the 1840s, certainly by the time he goes to Congress, and then when he reintroduces himself to Illinois politics in the 1850s, after he left Congress, which is kind of doing his law practice for a few years. I think this idea that he recognized the power of words, and that you have to be careful about the kind of words that you use to try to adjust the opinions of the people. There's one of my favorite Lincoln lines. It might be my favorite Lincoln line. It comes out in 1842. I talk about it. It's in that first substantive chapter on prudence and moderation. The address to the Washington Temperance League in 1842. He says, "If you would win a man to your side, you must first convince him that you are his friend." So most people, if you call them names, if you call someone a jerk face, they stop listening to you. So you win them over by convincing them that you sincerely want what is good for them, and that's usually not done by calling them names or accuse them of either being, some combination of a fool or a knave. So you need to talk to people in such a way as, even when you disagree with them, you recognize at least partial justice of what your opponents believe. You try to appeal to their better natures. You try to build some sympathy with them. And once you've done that, then you can start to convince, then you can start to persuade, right? Name calling and overly heated vituperative language is not usually persuasive to people who disagree with you. And so again, if we want to win people over to our side, we need to be very careful in the kind of rhetoric we engage in. I think Lincoln is a great case in point of statesmen of our day. If we want to cultivate statesmen, educating them in Lincoln's rhetoric and showing how did he go about structuring an argument is a great educative tool that statesmen today, or people who are interested in promoting statesmen, can use Lincoln as a model of how to go about doing that.
Right. And I just want to back up one moment, Professor, to the introduction, and I want to read a portion of the introduction. We hear the word democracy thrown around all the time. Everybody says democracy. We have our democracy's in danger. Our democracy needs to be preserved. Our democracy did this and democracy that. But let me just read a portion of your introduction. It says, one of the many virtues of Abraham Lincoln is that he seemed able to stand both inside and outside democracy at the same time. And he revered the doctrines of the Declaration of Independence and the moral cause of democracy, while being able to offer friendly critiques of democracy's excesses. And I find that a great introduction to what's going to occur as we go on through the book. But it is so true that we have to be very careful. The founders understood that direct democracies historically didn't last long. And that's why Madison and the founders went to such great extremes to make sure that we were a constitutional representative, or constitutional Republican government, not just a democracy, correct?
Yeah, I think if I'm going to get my political science geek on, but I think the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans will appreciate this, because one of my favorite Federalist papers is Federalist number 9, right, which is Alexander Hamilton, and that's when he critiques what he calls the petty republics of ancient times and the wild vacillations between anarchy and tyranny. Right, there was a reason why throughout the history of political thought, democracy was seen as a deficient form of government. It wasn't because throughout history, people were just a bunch of elitist snobs who didn't trust the people, though there's some truth to that, but because everywhere democracy had been tried, it had been turned into a mob. As Madison says, what is it, in 55? If every Athenian assembly had been, if every Athenian had been a Socrates, still every Athenian assembly would have been a mob. And so then Hamilton in 9 goes on to say, but the science of politics has advanced. We know things like, you mentioned some of these, JR, things like separation of powers, things like an independent judiciary, things like representative government instead of direct voting, right? The opinion is channeled through representatives, right? And through this, we can create a more stable democracy, because unlike us, because we've got 230, 40 plus years of democracy, this is kind of where the book starts, you're kind of alluding to it, is we tend to take this for granted, like democracy is easy. Like this stuff just sort of happens, when really democracy needs to be cultivated. And that's what the job of the statesman is, like a Hamilton or a Madison or a Lincoln, is to lay out the principles, and then through action as statesmen, which all these three men were, is to help cultivate democracy, that it stays within these limits, so the people don't become too extreme and they don't start violating people's rights instead of protecting our rights, which our Declaration says is the whole purpose of government, is to secure these rights. Governments are instituted among men. That's the whole point of this thing.
Exactly. And let me give our audience, Professor, an actual working analogy, if you will. This November, there's a referendum on the ballot in New Jersey to allow legal usage of marijuana. Now, this, of course, is a referendum vote. This is an example of direct democracy. This is really a progressive idea that came about through Wilson and was blown up through FDR. And we'll talk about progressivism as we move on in our future talks. But the fact is that the founders intended our state assemblymen, our senators in the state house, and our assemblymen in the assembly to deliberate, to argue, to use rhetoric, the old ancient idea of rhetoric, which was proving your point and debating the issue and using moderation and using time to think about this issue, as opposed to allow the public to make the decision on a vote, which will only take that one day in which we vote. And the time prior to it, there's no deliberating going on at all amongst our representatives. So the founders would not agree with that idea of direct democracy. They would rather want the deliberation process, and that we elect our representatives to make these decisions, because we're too busy making a living. We're out in the world doing what we have to do to make a living, raising our family and so forth. But we elect these representatives to make these very important decisions based on deliberation and rationale, correct?
And what sometimes, it's coincidentally my own state. Here's my state flag right there, state of South Dakota. We also have a marijuana provision on our ballot. We have initiative and referendum in our state as well. And precisely this the point. It's not because the people are quote unquote stupid. It's because we don't have the time, in some cases, the education to make a deliberate choice. The point is not just for the will of the people to reign, but for the deliberate will of the people to reign. Deliberate means on purpose. You've thought it through. And as you say, oftentimes when we do direct democracy, it's not really deliberative. It's democracy through 30-second campaign ads. That's our voter education. Whereas if it was in the legislature, there'd be committee hearings, there'd be witnesses, there'd be debates, there would be amendments. Right? We don't get a chance to amend the things on our ballots to make them better. Now, we had an experience here in South Dakota 4 years ago where the people, by a narrow margin, but we passed this big campaign finance regulation. And then the legislature had to repeal it because it was obviously unconstitutional. There's no way that would have made it through the state legislature, but someone got on a ballot and we voted in, and within 2 seconds when the legislature reconvened after elections, well, we can't have this and it was unworkable. If they actually enforced it, half of our legislature would have had to quit because they wouldn't have met the standards of the law. And there were things in there that were obviously unconstitutional. And that's what happens when people make something that sounds good. We're going to regulate campaigns to make them more fair. That's a great slogan, except this actual piece of legislation was unworkable in practice and unconstitutional in principle, at least certain portions of it.
Right. And of course, it's also easy to understand to where the representatives want to get the heat off of their back. And they'll say, well, we'll let the people decide. But yet they're elected by the people to make these type of decisions and these rational, that's the impetus behind why the representatives, they don't want to make these hard decisions anymore. And giving referendum balloting takes the heat off of them, where it's firmly placed upon them as we elect them. But as we wind down the show, I want to talk a little bit about this book. You've written it really in two parts: the part one, Lincoln and the Architect of Democracy's Soul, and then part two, the Domestic Lincoln, Presidential Power in the Second American Revolution, which of course we'll talk about with our future program. But I just want to touch a bit for a moment on the part one, Lincoln and the Architect of Democracy's Soul, and of course Lincoln and the Political Virtues of Prudence and Moderation. And I thought it was very interesting, Professor, that you were using speeches, some of Lincoln's early speeches, like the perpetuation of our political institutions, quote unquote, and the Washington Temperance Address, quote unquote. And these are discussed in this first chapter, and it establishes Lincoln's defense of moderation and prudence as chief political virtues. Yeah. And examples from his early career are indicative of this. So just talk a little bit about that, these.
Let's real quick. Well, let's just define our terms. Because traditionally, prudence and moderation are considered the great virtues of the statesman. So prudence is, in the Greek, there's this word phronesis, which is sometimes translated as practical wisdom, sometimes as prudence. So theoretical wisdom tells us what is right and what is wrong. Practical wisdom or prudence tells us how to achieve what is right, right? So assuming we've reasoned right about what good ends are, like for example, slavery is wrong, we should get rid of it, then prudence tells us what's the right way to get to achieve this good end. Moderation means not just, someone who's in the middle, right? Like sometimes I say this in the book, we think of a moderate politician, like I call Bill Clinton a moderate. He believes at least some things, he signed welfare reform into law, NAFTA into reform, some things that Republicans want. Or like a Susan Collins from Maine is considered a moderate because sometimes she sides with the Democrats, even though she's a Republican. But really, moderation is a disposition, not a policy view. It's having all good things in the right amount. So we all know, for example, in democracy, there are various good things. Rule of law is a good thing. Will of the people, as we talk about, that's a good thing, where there's a will of people. Protecting rights, consent to the governed, all these things, these are all good. The equality, these are all good things. But we also know that sometimes these things come into conflict. We're just talking now about, we believe in consent to the governed, but there are good things beside consent to the governed. So we don't just want consent to the governed. There are other good things we're trying to achieve, like liberation. Liberation is also a good thing. So a moderate statesman knows how to balance these things, right? Then prudentially knows how to follow the right course to get these things. And so I think these early speeches, there's been a lot written about the Lyceum speech in recent months because it's so much about mob rule and rule of law. So as we have political unrest and violence in places like Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, Kenosha, all these places, even New York City has had some of this. A lot of people have dug up the Lyceum speech, the rule of the mob. And precisely, rule of the mob in some ways is very democratic. It's the voice of the people, is it not? But the mob is not how we make decisions, right? And so the Lyceum speech is this great speech that's all about why we should revere the rule of law. And it's not just the will of the people that rules, but the will of people through a certain predetermined process, right? And because we are not impulsive, and because the people can will incorrectly and can end up violating people's rights. Even think of something like the assumption of innocence of someone who's accused. We do that because we want to tell a jury, assume that they're innocent, because we can get very excited when we see someone accused of a very heinous thing. We want to punish them. We want to restrain that. And this is what Lincoln is talking about in that Lyceum address.
Great. And you really do go to great lengths to give proper definitions for the word prudence and moderation as well. And you just touched upon it now. I want to show again where you're going to want, our audience is going to want to purchase the book. Get the book as soon as you can. And the professor is going to be back for a couple of more episodes. So buy the book, and then you'll be able to formulate some questions, which we'll take in future broadcasts of Professor Schaff joining us. And here's the book, Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. It's on Amazon. That's where I got it from. And you're going to want to go out and get that. And also I want to share I did have your Facebook page up. I wanted to put that, or not your Facebook page, Professor, but your johnschaff.com, correct?
My webpage. Yep.
Yeah, I did have that up.
myname.com so people can find it.
Right. So, but on there you'll see the other book which we'd like to talk about with you. I believe you even wrote a book on George McGovern. Is that true, Professor?
I have a chapter in a book on George McGovern, a local hero here in South Dakota. I have the
yes.
I remember Mr. McGovern. I had the unfortunate in McGovern studies task of writing about the 1972 election. So not the highlight of George McGovern's
Yeah.
career, which I met McGovern a couple of times before he died. And every time I've written about George McGovern a couple of times, and it's about the 1972 election, then the 1980 election when he got beat by Jim Abner when he got kicked out of the Senate, voted out of the Senate. And so every time I write about George McGovern, it's about when McGovern lost. So.
Of course, Senator McGovern was a great admirer of Lincoln as well.
There was. He wrote
Of course,
he wrote a book about Lincoln shortly before McGovern died. He had a book about Lincoln. His interpretation of Lincoln and mine are not the same. But nonetheless, he was.
We'll see that later.
George McGovern was a PhD in history from Northwestern University, but also highly influenced by progressive historians.
Yes.
And as was common, he got his PhD in the late 40s. It was not uncommon back then for the progressive historians really dominated the academy in that era, especially at Northwestern where he was.
Great. Well, Professor, we're going to have you back. Well, let's set up another date to go through the rest of the book. But I encourage the people to get out there and to get this great book, Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy.
I have it right here. There it is.
There it is, right there. There's another shot of it. And you're going to want to purchase this book, Constitutional Republicans Everywhere. So much that we can learn. And I really congratulate you, Professor, on a great job with the book. We'll have you back and we'll continue on with the chapters in the book. But I really appreciate your time today. And we'll have you back very soon to continue this discussion. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please share the video, share others, the good work that Professor Schaff is doing and the fine book that he's written. And I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Professor, I know you'll join me in thanking everyone and saying, as Lincoln did, liberty to all. Thank you and have a good day.